In April 2021, 12 European football clubs announced the formation of a Super League that would reshape the modern football landscape. But approximately 48 hours later, those plans appeared to be in tatters, with the 6 English clubs involved leading the charge to the exit door. So 12 months later, the question is, what happened? I was lucky enough to be joined by Alex Fynn to help provide some answers. Alex has had a long and distinguished career in the organisation of football and was an advisor to various football clubs, the FA, but also crucially Silvio Berlusconi during his early attempt to establish a European Super League. So we're in good hands as we look back at the games that changed football, the rise and fall of the ESL, and what the future may hold. Hi Alex, welcome to the pod.
Well, it's very kind of you to have me, Danny.
Absolute pleasure. The European Super League, born in Europe, died in England. Is that a fair summary?
Like all good summaries, there's a grain of truth in it. By coincidence, the whole idea began in England. There were a number of games that actually changed the destiny of European football. And the first one, or it actually was a couple of games, 1954, English champions Wolves hosted on BBC television floodlight midweek games against key teams from Europe. At the time, Honvéd from Hungary and Spartak Moscow. Before a one-channel audience of literally millions, they beat them. Whereupon the English media, maybe in true fashion, proclaimed Wolves champions of the world, or at least champions of Europe. And this was too much for the French to bear. And they rightly came up with a plan. It was the brainchild of 2 journalists at L'Équipe, Jacques Ferrand and Gabriel Hanot. And they came up with the idea of a European League in order to answer the question, which is the best team in Europe? Now, the best team is the one that wins a league. But in those days, in the mid-50s, communications, transportation, electronic industry being what it was, there was no way that you could have a pan-European league. So they did the next best thing. And once again, they went back to England and were inspired by the FA Cup. And so the European Cup was born, and the 2 French journalists turned it over to UEFA to administer it. And that was the beginning of the tournament. And it had a long, illustrious career as a knockout tournament until such time as the big clubs became hostage to the players in terms of the need to earn more money.
And therefore, the European Cup became the Champions League.
We saw the games that changed football, the Wolves game against the floodlight continental opposition. And secondly, believe it or not, the second most important game was in 1985 when Glasgow Rangers lost to Osasuna in the European, either Cup Winners' Cup or the UEFA Cup. And that set Campbell Ogilvie, the Rangers secretary at the time, thinking, how can we devise a situation whereby we are not hostage to the luck of the draw and going out the first round? How can we devise a competition whereby we're guaranteed at least 6 games, 3 at home? So he came up with a plan for a group system, which was rejected by UEFA. We move on a year to another game that changed football dramatically, and this may be perhaps most important of all. 1987, Napoli were drawn against Real Madrid, champions of Italy, the champions of Spain. Now, nobody cared a previous year or two when Nottingham Forest drew Liverpool, the champions of Europe versus the champions of England, because nobody cared about England. But when you had the 2 key Latin countries, and one of them was going to lose its participant at the first hurdle, it was summarized by Silvio Berlusconi, who had recently taken over as the owner of Milan. And Berlusconi said, the European Cup is an historical anachronism. To think that a club like Milan could go out in the first round It is not modern thinking. And as a result of that, I came into the picture. At the time, I was working at Saatchi & Saatchi, and I got a call from Roberto Lasagna, who was the head of our Italian agency, and subsequently Berlusconi's right-hand man when he pushed for the presidency of Italy. So he was working for him in the way more than Alistair Campbell worked for Tony Blair. So at that time, he was just the head of our Italian agency, Saatchi & Saatchi Italia. And he said to me, Alex, here's the job you always wanted, design a Super League plan for Berlusconi, which I did. And my head was turned, and I gave him what I thought he wanted, not necessarily what football needed. But paradoxically, it was a very similar plan to the Super League plan that we saw as a debacle last year. It was based on the idea of merit, but also historical tradition, and it featured the big clubs in the big television markets. There were going to be 18 teams in it, more from the key football nations than the smaller nations, and it was going to be played in addition to the domestic league. So what would have to go is maybe one or two fixtures in the top division, and certainly the relegation of the cup competitions. Well, this plan was used as a catalyst. So along with the Glasgow Rangers plan, who were sent packing by UEFA on a couple of occasions, but on the third occasion, backed by Berlusconi's tub thumping with waving not Chamberlain's piece of paper, but Alex Fynn's piece of paper. And here is the solution. So UEFA caved in. So in 1992, they changed the European Cup at the behest of fear from the Berlusconi plan, more practical reasons for Glasgow Rangers, who had devised a system where there was a group system, and the European Cup became a group system.
I guess the question then becomes, why make the change? What was the catalyst for this push for an evolution of a tournament that is generating a lot of money, that is broadly seen as successful, it's marketable? Why the change? Why did that change come about at the time that it did and in the way that it did?
The Champions League had been going very well, nicely under the current system. You know, it was a hybrid. It was both a league and a cup, and it was doing very well. And UEFA felt that they still were under threat. This time, the threat was a private one from the big clubs, and therefore they wanted to change the system, and the system is going to be changed in the way UEFA want. But this was too much for the big clubs to actually bring in clubs, for example, to increase the number of clubs, but to increase the number of clubs that didn't guarantee the big clubs passage to the or out of the group system. And that is a system that actually suggested to UEFA that they'd done what was required. They'd reformed the tournament once again. They'd given the big clubs greater opportunity to survive and prosper, but apparently not enough. And that really was the straw that broke the camel's back and actually created the idea of a breakaway Super League.
Now, some have suggested that other key factors in the putative formation of the European Super League was the impact of COVID on clubs' finances, and also as a kind of reaction against the increasing power and ownership of clubs from what can be broadly described as countries, so sovereign wealth funds and major investors that have national backing. So did those two factors, do you think, help to explain why we had the situation that we did a year ago?
Well, the first of your factors does. The second really is it's only suggested by you, I would humbly suggest, in hindsight, and that didn't play a part in it. What did play a part was the massive losses that the epidemic wrought on the clubs. So you had a situation whereby Milan revenue to wages turnover was over 100%. In other words, they were spending more on wages than they were getting through any other revenue source. The losses were, well, exponential. Over 100 million for some of the breakaway Super League clubs, just under 100 million for the others, but all of them were substantial losses. So they'd lost in broadcast income, they'd lost in commercial income, they'd lost in matchday income, and the only thing that remained and was going up in this period of crisis were players' wages. And here was an opportunity once and for all to actually institute a salary cap. Because if the Super League had happened as it was planned, they would have had the best players playing in the top league in the top club league in the world, and they would have been paying for the top salaries. So there would have been no temptation to go elsewhere, because the idea was underwritten massively, so that the clubs, instead of getting, as they did now, the last year that we can look at in terms of individual clubs' return from the Champions League, Liverpool got 98 million for reaching the final, winning the competition, and Tottenham 90 million for being runners-up. That would have been doubled in the proposed Super League, and therefore they could have afforded to pay the players exactly what they wanted and still make a profit. And there would have been, I repeat, no temptation to go elsewhere, because they couldn't earn any more money elsewhere. So I think that was the key motivator.
Do you not think, though, that the players will always try and find a way, and will succeed in finding a way to get somebody to pay them more money? That generating more revenue is a little bit like adding lanes to the M25 motorway, that in the end, all that happens is the capacity always ends up being filled by either the cars on the motorway or wages to the players.
I'm afraid I think you're right. But if this plan had happened, they could have curbed the wages, at a high level, but they could have actually had a salary cap. And that salary cap could have been directly related to revenue. So it really wasn't a salary cap as such, but more a spending cap. So the clubs themselves would have spent on wages exactly what they could have afforded, and it would have satisfied the players because they would have been getting a wage increase. And they couldn't get a wage increase anywhere else in the football world.
I think it was Steve Parish who, on the recent documentary, was quoted as saying that one of the reasons why the Super League started to fall apart was that it was seen as a little bit naff, but also a little bit American. And I think American owners have probably been disproportionately blamed for the Super League and indeed for some of the ills in ownership of certainly English clubs. And of course, JP Morgan were the backers, an American bank, the backers of the European Super League proposal. And also probably worth saying that the model as proposed was somewhat similar to the US franchise system for professional sports. Do you think that's quite an unfair characterization, particularly when you look at the makeup of the clubs involved? Out of the 12, I think 4 had American ownership, 2 were Russian and Chinese, and 4 had local or certainly indigenous owners across AC Milan, Juve, Barca and Real. Of the 12 clubs involved, 8 of them are not owned by Americans.
No, but they would have been tempted by the fact that they were founder members and as such were not going to be relegated, and that they, for once in their lives, they could actually control the costs that really brought them to their knees during the epidemic, which was players' wages.
Yeah, I personally think that it's very easy to blame American owners and blame the American influence for certain outcomes. But it does seem to me that in many ways, some of the key instigators of the European Super League did come from the kind of more traditional European paternalistic corporate mentality that possibly Real Madrid represents, to some extent Juve represents, and to some extent AC Milan represents. And so...
You're quite right, but they borrowed from the American system. The American system suited them down to the ground. The American owners are not steeped in the culture of European football. But the owners that you've just mentioned, of the Latin giants certainly are, but they could see a situation whereby they were hemorrhaging money, and here was an opportunity not only to stop it once and for all, but also to earn themselves vast profits.
And perhaps then profits are the driving force here, because when you actually look at the Champions League format, and coming back to this idea that there needed to be some change, in fact, there's hardly been any kind of domination of the Champions League by any individual team. Real Madrid are the only team to have retained it. They won it 3 times in a row. But apart from that, no other team has managed to retain the trophy. And so there's been much more of a dispersal of access to the later rounds and general success in the tournament on the pitch itself. And so, again, it seems so incongruous that owners who were steeped in the history of European football would feel that this kind of approach would make any sense, and particularly as it related to European football.
Well, I have to disagree with you, because the way that UEFA structured the Champions League meant that the big clubs in the big countries dominated the system. So you had, for example, of the 32 teams that qualified a couple of versions ago, 16 came from the top 5 nations. The top 4 nations, because we should exclude France in this case. So the idea that it wasn't going to work for the Real Madrid or Juventus only stands up if they're not going to qualify. And they are going to qualify, whether champions or runners-up or in 3rd or 4th place.
That's very interesting, because that actually, in a way, changes the definition of success from winning on the pitch to just participation. That's a dramatic change in mindset from what we're used to, where it's the winning that really drives people's aspirations and love of the game.
I think it can be summed up when Arsene Wenger, a number of years ago, said the first trophy is finishing 4th. What made him happy was the fact that by finishing 4th, Arsenal had a large amount of money that they could be guaranteed on. If you wind back the clock, the reason that people loved the Old Star European Cup was that from time to time, Steaua Bucharest or Olympic Marseille or small countries could throw up a wonderful team like Ajax in Holland, and they would challenge the giants from Italy, Germany, and Spain. And remember how long it took England to actually win the tournament. And then when they won it, it was through not just Liverpool, but Nottingham Forest. So these were the stuff that dreams are made of. That on any given day, David could beat Goliath. Well, as Berlusconi forecast, all those years ago, that isn't modern thinking, that a big club could go out in the first round merely because of they had an off day, or because of a refereeing decision, or because of climatic conditions, or because the other club actually bought the match, which is something that did go on. So at least we have now a situation whereby, as the current format, it is really more meritocracy than anything else. It is a pity that there's going to be less meritocracy in the new format, where clubs are going to be able to qualify through a historical coefficient because they were good in yesteryear and not necessarily today.
Why do you think the Super League, as proposed around about 12 months ago, fell away so quickly, pretty much within 48 hours?
The reason it failed was that it didn't realise the way that the culture of football in Europe and the rest of the world has grown up. It's not the American system. Today's underdog isn't necessarily tomorrow's hero. The draft system has a way of evening itself out, so that no one dynasty dominates. Well, life in European football and world football has always been on the side of the big battalions, and it will always be thus. But it's based on a merit system. So the big battalions start with a built-in advantage because of their history and tradition and current wealth in terms of their spending power. But there is an opportunity within a league format to succeed. and the nearest you get to a league format in Europe is the current Champions League. The proposed league had nothing whatsoever to do with our history and tradition. It was based purely on size, purely on non-relegation or promotion, and therefore merit fell way down the pecking order. And that is the reason why it failed. It also failed to recognize that football is both a live event and a television spectacular. And it only survives in both of these. It survives as a television spectacular, one, because it might be entertaining football, but two, and most important, it's played before sellout crowds. You know, like extras on a film set, they provide the verisimilitude, the vibrant atmosphere. And without that, you wouldn't get the television rights fees being paid that are being paid. So this system took no account of the fans' interest, both in terms of television subscription for those who prefer to watch at home, or those who help create the live event of substance by going to the ground. They didn't come into the reckoning one iota. And therefore, on that basis, it was doomed to fail.
I was reading a book recently by an author called Michael Lind, who wrote a book called The New Class War. And he talked about democracies of the West that are likely to remain stuck in a doom loop, oscillating between an arrogant oligarchic overclass and a disempowered majority. And in many ways, what we saw last year was a kind of a manifestation of that. And I wonder whether the strength of backlash, particularly in England against the European Super League proposals, was another manifestation of that broader majority saying, for you guys at the top, you really do have to listen to us. We're not going to just sit back and allow ourselves to be pushed around in the way that we have been in the previous few years and decades.
Well, all I can do is to agree with those sentiments and the way that they were beautifully expressed. We have to remember, though, Danny, that the factory owners always win in the end. If the workers are successful, they get better working conditions and better pay, but they do not usurp the boss's power. And that's the situation in football.
So has the European Super League failed? Is it dead, or is it just resting?
You remind me of the dead parrot sketch. It depends which side you want to take, that of the shopkeeper or that of the purchaser. I think this current format is certainly dead, but the idea will never go away until they're able to control players' wages, reduce players' transfer fees, and control the amount of money that agents take out of the game. What football wants and what football needs is both more live events and less non-events, which means a structure to provide a place for everyone. Now, a Super League, as currently formulated, does not provide a place for everyone. It just provides a place for the powers that be. And that isn't the way that European football should run. It wasn't the way that European football was conceived back in the 50s. And certainly it isn't the way that it should be run now. That's why there has to be a spending cap, both at home and abroad, irrespective of what happens to the Super League. And if one good thing that comes out of this Super League fiasco, is that they would have introduced a spending cap. Now, we can do the same in this country, but it's going to take regulation for it to happen. And who wants the government involved in football? Football can't police itself, so we're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Final question is one that has been alluded to in the past and in the discussion about the Super League, but I think is a broader question that's certainly related to it. It seems to me that the debate around the European Super League is part of a wider discussion about the future of football, because the players are paid and have as their employers the clubs who were the proponents, certainly 12 of them, of the creation of the European Super League. But those players are also beholden to their national organizations, who in turn are themselves running a separate revenue line through their international football and are beholden to an organization that sits above UEFA structure in FIFA, who seem pretty keen to grow their revenues and to grow their presence in the football share of voice and share of mind through expansion of more national competitions. And so it seems to me that what happens with the European Super League debate needs to be contextualized in a wider discussion about what football will look like going forwards, because there either need to be more professional players to play in all these games, or something's going to give, and either national competitions, national club competitions, or European and regional club competitions are going to have to fall by the wayside.
It's a perceptive analysis that you put forward, and it's one that I think needs to be looked at. Certainly people are not looking at it in that way at the moment. The greatest glory for players is winning the World Cup or the European Championship on behalf of their country. That is, I would suggest, their greatest pride and satisfaction. But unfortunately, what counts most for players is their bank balance. And therefore, as you rightly point out, they are beholden to the clubs. So you have this conflict with FIFA nominally responsible for the most important competitions, but UEFA responsible for, in a different definition of the term, the most important competition because it pays the most. So there's a direct conflict of interest here. And that's why UEFA and FIFA are at loggerheads. Unfortunately, it doesn't throw up statesman-like people. We've seen the incompetence and corruption that had gone on in FIFA. UEFA has not fallen foul to such means, but they are really at the beck and call of the big clubs. So you have that pulling in one direction. On the other, you have FIFA with a lust for power and glory, and being driven by people who are really not fit to actually run the game in the way that it should be, in terms of a place for countries and a place for clubs. So they're on a collision course, and something will have to give. And what will give, I think, is the fact that what counts, as you rightly say, are the bottom line is the players. Because without the players, we have no game. And without the players playing a game, we have no fans. And without fans, the game is nothing. So fans have to be taken into account to some extent, and they are being taken into account more and more. The answer lies in finding statesmen who will fight their own corner, but have the vision to see that their own corner is part of a larger game. And so far, we're lacking that. And until we do find that, there will always be a conflict of interest. There will always be a problem between being in a rock and a hard place. And the only people who will come out of it in the way that makes them happy to some extent is the way that the players and their agents will march all the way to the bank. So, it's not a solution that anyone can find very easily, but it has to be found. Otherwise, we'll keep coming back to these sort of crises, like the spectre of the European Super League.
Well, Alex Fynn, thank you so much for sharing your views. I think, if nothing else, what happened a year ago showed that the fans can have a voice. And if there's a way of marrying the sort of leadership that you talk about with that mass, powerful influence that the fans can have, that will hopefully find a more stable and equitable outcome for football. And we'll certainly keep an eye out to see if the dead parrot is actually dead or is just resting. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to expound.